what you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. I'm your host Mike, and a big thank you for joining me for the latest episode. On tonight's show, we have a new guest. His name is Shanmuganathan N, but we can call him Shan, and he wrote a fantastic book called RIP USD, which is referring to the US dollar, and it's talking about the end of the dollar system and a return to gold and silver, otherwise known as real money. It's a fantastic book, and I reached out to Shan just a few weeks back, and he said, Mike, once gold reaches $3,000 per ounce, I'll come on your show and we'll do that interview. I was 100% confident that that was going to happen, as was Shan. And sure enough, just the other week, it did happen. And now gold is already at $3,150 per ounce. So Shan reached back out to me and we did our interview. Now, Shan is somebody who's been writing on gold and silver for many years. He's written for Doug Casey, for Mark Faber, basically the heavyweights of the investing space. And his book lays out why gold and why silver are going to become money once more. So that's what we're going to be discussing in tonight's show. So members, please head over to parallelmike.com to sign in and listen to the full episode. And if you are not a member yet, but you are enjoying the content, well, you can consider becoming a member over on parallelmike.com, where you can access part number 2 of each and every episode. I'm also available for one-to-one wealth preservation consultations, where I can help you and your family answer key questions when it comes to getting prepared financially and practically. And of course, I specialize in precious metals as well, so I can help you put together a really robust portfolio in that regard. But I'm also running group coaching for investors, and that begins again at the end of May. So we do have a waiting list for that. And if you'd like to join us, it's 12 weeks live with me, where I teach you all of the skills that I use to protect, preserve, and grow my family's wealth going into harder times and a financial reset. So if tonight's episode inspires you to take action, please check out my website for more information. In closing, I hope you're all well, healthy, and reasonably happy. Take care of yourselves, guys, and I'll see you all in the next one. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. We are joined today by a new guest. It is author Shanmuganathan. And Shan, you wrote a book recently that was extremely interesting to me. It was called RIP USD, and it was about the end of the US dollar and the return to a gold-backed system, which is something that I've been discussing for a number of years as well. Lots of crossover, and I think the book was excellent. So I really wanted to invite you on the show, Shan, particularly now that we're kind of a year out from you writing that book, and all of the things that we've both been discussing are happening. But today, we're going to get into the book, its contents, talk about monetary history, and then kind of try to figure out where we go next. So welcome to the show, Shan. Please tell listeners just a little bit more about your background and what led you to writing this book.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be on your show. I'm an investor and a writer by profession. I had worked in the US for about 10 years. That's from 1995 to 2005. And I was an IT consultant. As part of that, I developed an interest in the space of finance and economics. And so I just quit my job, and I've been an investor ever since. My book, RIP USD, 1971 to 202X. So the dollar that has existed from 1971 is a very different dollar from the one that existed prior to that for about 200 odd years. And that's what I tried to say, that the dollar that has existed, the unbacked fiat dollar that has existed from 1971 is going to actually come to an end very soon. And the US government will be forced to go back to a gold-based dollar before the end of the decade. That's the thesis of that book.
Yeah, and this is something that people have been predicting forever. There's been so many people who have written about the end of the dollar and spoke about it and done podcasts on it. I've read books going back 20, 30 years talking about this. So I guess listeners are going to ask the question, why now, Shan? Is it imminent? Is it something that we're going to see in the next 5 years, 10 years? And do you believe that we're actually going to be proven right in the short term this time rather than the long term, in which
Right.
everyone will eventually be proven right on this? The dollar has to die. All currencies that are fiat die. But are we in that end game right now is the question.
It's a very interesting question. If you think about it, Ron Paul joined politics in 1971, okay, when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. And he joined politics because he wanted to put the dollar back on the gold standard. It's been a very long wait, 50 years, right? So at some point, all of us will be proven right. But the thesis of my book, as explained in detail, is that we are very close to the end. Like the bubble is so big at this particular point in time that it can't be pushed anymore. Very rational arguments could have been made even 5, 10, 15 years ago that the US dollar has to die. Okay, but the case at this particular point in time is so compelling that I can't see an alternate way out at all. Now, the national debt is so high. It's $36 trillion at this particular point in time. And the interest cost on servicing the debt is absolutely skyrocketing. It was less than $300 billion just a couple of years back. And it's almost quadrupled to more than $1 trillion. And a year forward, it could well be $2 trillion. And that is on a $5 trillion federal budget income. So 40% of the federal income is going only to servicing just the interest costs on the national debt. And this does not include the unfunded liabilities and a lot of other issues. So I don't think the US government will be able to push it further out. And that is also the reason why Trump recognized and then got in must to do this dodge. Okay, but if you really look at what they've been able to accomplish, it's so small. It just affects a third decimal on the national debt at this particular point in time. So the problem is so big that it's going to be almost impossible to fix. What the US government will eventually do is to just hyperinflate the debt away. So instead of doing an honest default and say sorry, we can't pay the national debt, we can pay only 10, 20, 30 cents of the dollar. They'll just print the dollar, and that is going to actually erode the purchasing power of the US dollar. That's how this game is going to end. And the US dollar will, at the end of the day, be forced to go back to a gold standard.
And I think other nations are recognizing this already. They are collecting gold hand over fist right now. Central banks across Europe, China, since 2008 has accumulated vast amounts. And that's because they understand that all of those treasuries that they were either coerced into buying or bought willingly are going to be defaulted on at some point, right?
Right. China has been accumulating gold for a very long time. If you look at the reported statistics, the People's Bank of China, which is the Chinese central bank, okay, they hold only 3,000 tons of gold. But unofficially, I think they hold something like 30,000 tons of gold. Okay, this is from various estimates. And they hold this gold outside of the central bank. And what the governments have to report is actually what is held at the central bank level. Okay, so they've been able to accumulate without having had the need to report this particular amount of gold that they've accumulated. So I think the first instance is going to be a BRICS gold-backed currency. That is going to lead the world back onto a gold currency. If not the BRICS-backed gold currency, I would assume it's going to be the Chinese central bank that is going to actually go for a gold-backed yuan. But I probably suspect at this point it's going to be the BRICS gold-backed currency.
You know, there's so many things that I'm excited to get into in this interview, Shannon. You mentioned a few of them, but I think we need to slow this one down and maybe go back to the start and just discuss what money actually is. I think that's a great place to start this conversation for listeners. And I think you can't really understand gold unless you first and foremost understand money. And this is something that you discuss in your book. So let's begin with that, Shan. What is money? What are the key characteristics that money must possess? And why did gold become the money par excellence throughout history? And then maybe we can move on from that to talking about how when gold was taken away, we got this catastrophic debt burden that we've got today. So let's start there, Shan. What is money?
That's an excellent question. And it's so fundamental, yet most of the experts actually miss out on these things, right? It is because of confusion of what actually money is that we have got so many imposters such as Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, posing as an alternative to the US dollar. Okay, but if you really understand what the properties are of money, okay, we'll understand that only gold and silver can be money, right? We started with the barter system. That was around 7,000 BC. And slowly we moved on to a system wherein we got a medium of exchange that all buyers and sellers will accept, knowing that it is a very highly desired commodity within the marketplace. So at that particular point in time, wheat was the most desired commodity because we had transitioned from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle onto an agrarian style. So everybody needed wheat. It was in short supply. Because of this particular factor, wheat became this medium of exchange. And this continued for a couple of thousand years. then people shifted from wheat onto iron and copper. And this also continued for another 2000 years up till 2800 BC, when we shifted to the gold and silver. From 2800 BC up till 1971, gold has been money. Now, if you look at the properties that caused the shift from a system of barter onto this medium of exchange with wheat, and then iron and copper, and then gold and silver, there were 5 properties that is needed of this medium of exchange for it to be used as money. The first one, which is the most important and yet not well understood, is it has to be highly desired in the marketplace. If you look at the essay by Greenspan, Gold and Economic Freedom, he states that it had to be a premium product for it to be accepted. Now, you could question how come wheat is a premium product. It's not a premium product today. But if you go back to 7000 BC, wheat was a premium product in that particular society. Similar is the case with iron and copper. Iron and copper had just been discovered, and these were considered as precious metals in that particular era. So this property wherein this object or commodity is highly desired, that everybody would want it, is a prerequisite. And after that, we can look at the other properties, such as should be durable. We can store it for long periods of time. Like, for example, if you drop gold at the bottom of an ocean floor, even after thousands of years, it would still be intact, right? It's an extremely durable product. And it should be very divisible. Again, in the case of gold, you can divide it into 0.001 gram and then put it back together, and it would still have all the properties as compared to, say, something like a diamond. As soon as you cut it into half, it's going to lose most of its value. The 3Ds, as I call it, as extremely desirable, durable, divisible, and then should be convenient and consistent. So D3C2 properties, as I call it as. And in the form of consistent, if I say, is that each piece of gold is exactly the same as another piece of gold. And you can't say this about diamond or for other objects that have circulated as money. And it should be convenient. Gold packs a huge amount of value like into a small space. You can buy a house in almost any part of the world with about 5 to 10 kgs of gold. And this has been true for thousands of years. So it is these properties, that has allowed gold to become money. And this transition happened in the marketplace, without the governments enforcing their diktat. Historically, if you go back, the kings have never preferred gold as money, because they can just create it out of thin air. But the markets have repeatedly gone back to gold and silver as money for this particular reason. These have actually maintained their purchasing power, and they gave the freedom to the people, to the market participants. And the kings could not debase the value of the money as happens today. So for these reasons, gold became money.
Yeah, you went through it really well, Shan. It's such an extensive list of things that has to be achieved for something to be even acceptable as money. And when you go through everything that we could use, there's 88 naturally occurring elements, and there's only about 4 of them that hit most of those thresholds in terms of things like rarity, resistance to entropy. So you've got gold, silver, platinum, and palladium. And then of those 4, there's only really gold and silver that function well because platinum is not very well dispersed across the planet. It's more brittle. It's a higher melting point, so it's not efficient over time. If we want to keep reforming something, it requires more expended energy to reform platinum. So every civilization eventually gets to gold and silver because in terms of natural money, it's the par excellence. It's the best. And yet today, Shan, not many people understand that, one. And number 2, are actually now positing that Bitcoin has replaced gold and silver. So maybe before we get into all of the discussion around this, we could just speak to that for a second. Can you just lay out really simply why Bitcoin has not replaced gold in terms of money?
In fact, the very first product I described as being the most important, desire, that is, we should be able to do something with it. It should have non-monetary uses, like in the case of wheat, iron, and copper, right? There should be utility to this particular product. That is a fundamental criteria before it can be considered as money. Now, if you look at Bitcoin, what can be done with? There's almost nothing that we can do with, right? The fact that we spend tens of thousands of dollars to create a Bitcoin, doesn't mean the expended factors of production are stored as value like in a Bitcoin. As compared to gold, if you're spending $1,500 to extract an ounce of gold from the ground, it is stored as properties of gold, extremely ductile, malleable, anti-corrosive. It has got so many industrial applications that we can use it for. But we choose not to actually do it because it's so valuable. All the fundamental properties of gold makes it very highly desirable on account of which it became money. Bitcoin has got none of those properties. You can't do anything with the Bitcoin, right? So Bitcoin is just fool's gold, as Peter Schiff describes it. It's an imposter to gold. At some point, people will realize the fallacy of actually chasing these crypto coins. I don't know how far the date is out. Okay. But if you just look at the last 5-10 years, okay, Bitcoin has pretty much tracked Dixie. Okay. So as soon as the Dixie falls, I presume Bitcoin also will follow suit to that.
Yeah, it seems to be highly correlated with the most speculative areas of finance. So you could follow, for example, the chart of Bitcoin and Tesla over the past 3 or 4 years, and it was almost perfectly correlated. In fact, Tesla outperformed Bitcoin. So if you wanted to choose the best speculation, it was Tesla from around 2020 onwards. But my point is, it's really a technology, right? And technology has always become outdated, and you couldn't base your money on something that can be so easily accepted by a future technology. I mean, 10, 15 years, we will be, what we're doing now, Shan, I'm sure will be out of date. There'll be a new way to do what we're doing in terms of an interview. And I just can't see anybody with any sense trusting their entire family's intergenerational wealth to something that could be technologically accepted in the space of 1 decade. It's not going to happen. So Bitcoin doesn't really work as money. It works as a speculation and a technology, but I can't imagine in 100 years anybody even discussing Bitcoin. If they do, it will be of a curiosity that happened many years ago. Whereas we're now how many thousands of years in the future and we're still talking about gold, still in the media, central banks are still using it. So that's the real difference here, isn't it?
Absolutely. If you look at Bitcoin, some people are actually suggesting some use cases to it, right? Stating that it can be used for anonymous transfer of money, etc., etc. Those things are not valid. Now, even if one way to accept that particular argument that is being made by the Bitcoin proponents, then the second property, which is durable, it's highly questionable. It's not that the Bitcoin won't be around for a decade or 2 decades, okay, but the fundamental property for which you are making a use case for Bitcoin, how can we be sure that we'll use Bitcoin 10 years down the line to do the same thing? I mean, we're going to have far more sophisticated algorithms 10 years down the line as compared to what Bitcoin is. I'm sure somebody is going to actually break into the Bitcoin algorithm 5 years down the line. So all of the use cases that people are suggesting, these are not durable at all. There is no way we can be certain that Bitcoin can be used for any of these things 5, 10, 20 years down the line. As compared to gold, we have been using for thousands of years. And we can be certain that we'll be actually using it for another 100,000 years also.
Yeah, I think stability is so vital as well for money. I don't want to put my wealth into something that I'm using it as a savings vehicle, as a way to protect my wealth. I'm not talking about a speculation. And I think this is something that people often really mix up as well, especially new investors or people who don't know investing too well. They think that the goal of everything is for it to go up spectacularly in value. And it's like, no, some things it's about retaining value, having low volatility. I don't want to see things jumping up 30, 40% and down 50%. If it's my kid's future college fund, that would drive me crazy. I actually want it to just be steady, and I want it to at least match inflation. And that's what money's meant to do. Money isn't meant to go up in value. Money is meant to be stable. But the problem we've got is we've got a system where the currencies that we're forced to pay our taxes in and have our labor priced in is actually devaluing. And that's what gold ceased. That's what gold protected us from. So now let's maybe talk about that evolution of this system, because gold was money for pretty much all of history, Shan. We had different periods where it went to silver. We had periods where it disappeared and then empires collapsed because of it. But ultimately, the only time we had long-term monetary stability was when we was on a gold standard. So let's talk about that evolution. How far back do you want to take this? We could go back maybe to World War I, I think, was when they really started to remove gold from the system, wasn't it?
Right. Yeah, we could go back to 2800 BC if you want to and talk about money. Okay, but that is not going to be particularly useful for the audience. Okay, but we could start from the point where US actually started using gold as money, which is 1789, right? From that particular point onwards, up till 1913, okay, that is a classical gold standard for the US, right? Prices had actually declined by 50% in that 120-year period. People will not believe it if you actually give this number. Okay, but this is just statistics that I have reported in the book. Prices were continuously falling. And it's not that they did not have wars or famines or depressions. US had all of those things. And despite that, we had 120 years of falling prices, and prices were down by at least 50% at the end of that particular period. And this is without accounting for the massive improvements in quality to all the products that we had witnessed. And if you look at the growth of the US itself, the US had transitioned from very poor agrarian society to the most industrialized country in the world by 1930. Although the pound was actually still the actual reserve currency, okay, by 1920, the US dollar was the most widely held currency as a reserve currency. Although it had not yet acquired the status of the reserve currency of the world. That's how powerful the US became under the classical gold standard, right? And things started changing after 1913, after they got the Federal Reserve in. And that is when we started having this creeping inflation in the system. So we had 120 years of falling prices accompanied by massive growth. In fact, all of the fundamentals that you can think about, everything excepting for the internet, all of it happened under the classical gold standard. People moved from traveling on horse carts to trains and cars and planes. All of those transitions happened under the classical gold standard, which people find very hard to believe. It's after 1913, okay, we got the Federal Reserve in, and we started having this creeping inflation. Okay, but despite that, it's not till 1933, okay, that the US was able to break the shackles of gold and they started printing money. They got an equivalent of the Bretton Woods systems. Right? People could not accumulate gold in the US after 1930. They could not hold on to gold at all. And, and this system continued till 1971, wherein other central banks can exchange gold for the dollars that they're holding. And it's after 1971 that we actually broke off, and the dollar has been a free floating abstraction at that particular point in time. And a huge inflation after 1971. Now, people often mistake that they don't see the consumer prices inflation, but inflation is actually an increase in the supply of money. One of the consequences of inflation is that you see prices going up. So I distinguish between monetary inflation, okay, which is an increase in the supply of money and credit, and price inflation, which is a consequence of monetary inflation. And oftentimes, this consequence is much delayed by about even 10, 15 years if you think about it. And all of the price inflation effects that we are going to witness over the next 5-10 years is a consequence of the monetary inflation that we have had after 2008. After 2008, the US government has actually created trillions and trillions of dollars of debt that has not yet flowed into the commodity prices. And we have just started, that particular cycle. Okay, this cycle bottomed actually the Q4 of 2022. And after that, we have started picking up. So we have got years and years of price inflation coming up on us. And that is going to take gold prices to levels that we can't even imagine today.
The way you laid it out there, Shan, is actually pretty horrifying that all of the inflation that they have created, but is not yet in the system is now the dam's bursting on that. And that inflation is going to flood into the system. And we are already seeing it. I don't know about what it's like where you are, Shan, but I can tell you where I'm living, the inflation is crazy. In fact, I'll tell you a little story. I went to my wife's parents' city the other day. We lived there about 4 years ago. And we was actually looking at property in that region when we lived there. And the average property price would have been around 400,000 of our native currency. It's called the zloty. Probably not heard of that one, Shan. Stay away from it. It's toxic. It's probably one of the worst currencies in Europe.
I would say the same about the rupee. So
yeah, there's pretty bad there too, I guess. And the house prices were around 400,000, 500,000. You could get yourself a nice house with a plot of land. And I was walking past the estate agent just 5 days ago, and the house prices were averaging around 1.2 million, 1.5 million, 2 million. And I'd never even seen these numbers for house prices in this country. And that was now the norm. Now, of course, that's not because those houses are more valuable. It's because the currency is being debased, and also because people are terrified of inflation, that they're taking all of the savings out of the bank and throwing it into property just to have something to protect themselves. Now, one of the things that I think we're going to see, Shan, and I'd love to get your take on it, is whilst these house prices are going up nominally, and this is something people get confused by, they say, well, that's protecting my wealth. But actually, versus gold, all of those assets, the housing, the stocks, especially bonds, all of those things are collapsing in value versus gold, aren't they, Shan? That's kind of where we're at now, that these price gains that we're seeing in all the other assets are not real price gains, it's just nominal gains.
Absolutely, Mike. If you price even the stock market in terms of gold rather than the dollars or the native currency, whatever it is, you would see that the gains are not real at all. Like, for example, if you price S&P 500 like in terms of gold, it has probably lost value since the start of this millennium, which means all of the gains that we have seen is just an illusion created by monetary inflation. All the governments all over the world have created trillions and trillions of units, okay, that the price of all things have gone up. And especially I would divide the assets into three classes. And one is the financial assets, which is your stocks and bonds. And then you got real estate. And the third is commodities. So the first two asset classes have actually skyrocketed over the last 25 years. But if you look at commodities, it's almost the cheapest ever it has been on a relative basis compared to all these things. So that's why I'm saying all of the inflation, it is going to manifest ultimately like in the form of commodity prices. And that's going to happen over the next few years. If you think the inflation at this particular point in time is bad, okay, it's going to be substantially worse a couple of years down the line, 2, 3 years down the line.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're heading into a period of wealth destruction for the majority. And even for those people that have successfully navigated the last 20, 30 years, they could lose substantial amounts of their wealth unless they have a really solid wealth preservation strategy. And I think maybe the next decade or two, that is actually the priority. It's not about wealth growth anymore. It's actually about preserving what you already have. And if you manage to do that, vis-a-vis all of these other assets that are filled with debt that are going to collapse in value in real terms, you'll actually become much wealthier because you'll be able to buy those assets once they've declined maybe 80, 90%. And do you think it's going to be as bad as the 1929 crash and the subsequent depression? Shan, do you think that's where we're heading now?
Excellent question. I described this in the book as well. Okay, the period from 1929 to 1946. Okay, that 17-year period. Okay, we call that the Great Depression. And the period ahead, I've called it the Greater Depression in the book. And I've called it the Greater Depression in the book because if you look at 1929 to 46, okay, that was a deflationary period, okay, wherein prices were falling. And that was because we were on a quasi gold standard. The Fed could not actually inflate out. So for people who had dollars, okay, they could actually survive. Okay, but the period ahead, it's going to be highly like inflationary. So even if you have dollars, if you don't keep it in the right form, i.e., like in the form of gold, okay, your savings are going to get completely wiped out. At this particular point in time, very few people understand. So I think it's going to be a tumultuous period and it's going to be substantially worse as compared to 1929 to 1946.
Unfortunately, I agree with you, Shan. Unfortunately, I agree. That's why I'm sat here on a farm because we kind of joked off air that, you asked me where I am and I said, I'm on a farm and I'm not doing this because it brings in an income. I'm doing this really to protect myself from what comes next. Here on the land, we can grow our own food. And if it gets that desperate, we will not have to depend on the system. And, even if times just continue as they are, Shan, and things just get more and more inflationary, it's something you can protect yourself with on a homestead because unfortunately the prices of energy, the prices of food, it's just getting so high that it's kind of impossible to live for most people. I've got friends and family living in the UK and across Europe, and every one of them, Shan, tells me that they're really struggling. But you're suggesting that we're going into a period of really high inflation. And how high does it get, Shan? Is it hyperinflation where you're predicting this goes to?
I hope it doesn't get into hyperinflation. Okay, but that is definitely one of the possibilities that we should not rule out at this particular point in time. I recently written an article when gold prices 23,000 and I compared it to the price of $35 an ounce that existed in 1971. And I asked on a relative basis, is gold cheaper today? If you look at the data that I present there, comes across as an S. So gold prices are going to go substantially higher. And I explained in that particular article, we could even look at a six-digit price of gold, okay, which is $100,000 to an ounce. Now the world, even at $10,000 to an ounce, is going to be an unlivable one. So you can just extrapolate to see how bad it's going to be when it reaches $100,000 an ounce. So people in the US and in most of the Western societies are not used to this levels of inflation. Their savings levels is very low. They've been used to living with very stable prices for a very long time. That this is going to come as a shock. And I don't know how they are going to react when they realize that the social security is not there, as well as the Medicare. So how the US society responds is actually going to be terrifying. And that is my mentor, Doug Casey, actually prefers to say it's better to look at it on your TV rather than looking at it out the window. So he actually lives in Peru these days.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
As a society,
Better to watch it on your TV than outside of the window.
Yeah.
I like that.
So the US is going to change more in the next 5-10 years than it has in the last 50 years. And the change is not going to be in a positive direction. It's going to be very, very extremely difficult to live with that level. Actually live in the US.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that a little bit later in the interview, Shan, because there's a few questions I'd like to bring up around the potential that maybe they're trying to right the ship now. That's something some people are suggesting, and there's narratives around gold which kind of what we're discussing here, how gold's going to be used at some point to right the system after this period of wealth destruction. So let's kind of just flip back a little bit further then, just before we go to that point, because I just want to give listeners a little bit of a taste of what you thought about that end of the Bretton Woods system. Do you think this has been like a systemic assault on, you could say, the financial system by central bankers, that the taking away of gold was done purposefully to warp the system, to enrich the few and impoverish the many? And are they themselves going to be forced to allow this to go back to gold?
I think the US going off the gold standard was, if you look at the history, all the Keynes had written about all of his theories in the 1920s, it actually did not become popular in the US at all. It's only starting in the 1960s that people started experimenting with a little bit of deficit spending. And this deficit spending, it's always a camel's nose under the tent, right? You start with a small number, and then soon you realize, okay, that the entire camel is inside the tent, right? And that's what happened with deficit spending. And they started with deficit spending like in the 1960s early on, and after about 10 years, okay, they're spending huge amounts, right? And that's when the European countries realized, okay, that the US no longer has a goal to actually back the reserves. And France in particular, as well as Switzerland, they started converting their gold, all of their dollars onto gold. Okay, so the US was actually losing gold so fast, okay, that had they continued redeeming at the prevailing rate of $35 an ounce, okay, they would have entirely run out of gold within a year at that particular point in time. So Nixon abruptly closed the gold window, although at that particular point in time, he said temporarily he's closing the gold window. So the move to actually move on to this fiat system was not planned. It was forced by circumstances. And with the US having presidents not understanding fundamental economics, okay, they did not know. They didn't understand that deficit spending is bad to start with. All of the reasons given for deficit spending doesn't matter. Once you start debasing the currency, okay, the ultimate end happens to be poverty. It has to be poverty.
Yeah, debasing the currency is kind of like chopping down your fruit trees and using it as firewood. It's going to end in disaster. At some point, you have to pay the piper on that. And it's usually financial collapse, war, poverty. And where we are right now, Shan, is in a world where nobody has been on a sound money system. So unlike in history, when we had different societies, we had some maybe that were on a gold system, some might have been using silver, some might have been doing trade and barter because there was more primitive. We've now got this interconnected global financial system. Every single nation is on a fiat currency and every nation is bankrupt. Every government is bankrupt. So this isn't like anything we've seen in history before, is it?
That is absolutely correct. This is the first time the world is on a fiat currency standard. Okay, but that said, a lot of countries still running balanced budgets and they're running current account surpluses.
Sorry, Shan, I should correct myself. That's not fair to say. You've got nations like Russia who have a debt to GDP of 18%. So the entire world is not bankrupt. I should reframe that. The entire Western world is bankrupt. And I'll pass it back to you.
That's correct. Yeah, that is correct. So a lot of countries are going to be much better off compared to the Western countries of US, UK, and their allies. And some of the countries are changing for the better, positively. If you look at Argentina and all of the reforms introduced by Milei, okay, it is going to become one of the most prosperous nations on the world in the next 5-10 years. Okay, so some countries are going to do fabulously well, and those countries are the ones that are going to return to a system of balanced budgets, having limited government and sound money. Now, it's not very difficult for, as soon as the president recognizes that these things have to be done, it's not very difficult to do it. If you look at the history of Argentina, for 120 years, they did not have a balanced budget even once. Okay, then Milei comes, within 12 months, he just balances the budget. So how hard can it be for other presidents to do it? Okay, once they recognize the need to do it. But for that to happen, I think the society has to completely collapse and the currency has to collapse. And that will allow a president like Milei to come in and actually affect the changes. Now, if you look at Trump and what he's doing in the US, I don't think he recognizes the extent of the problem. Okay, he won an election promising almost everything to everybody. So how is he going to balance a budget? He can't, right? It's almost impossible to do it. So the US currency has to collapse. Okay, that will allow a true libertarian to come in and actually do the right thing, which is to balance the budget. That I think is at least 3 to 4 years away for the US.
Yeah, I think when it comes to these nations that are trying to somehow right the ship, whether it's legitimate or it's just theatrics for the masses to keep them engaged in the system. And I think you can argue that one till the cows come home because everyone has a different take on it. I think ultimately you always have the same power structures in play above those politicians. Politicians have to be funded right. They have to go through a whole process where they get sponsorship by oligarchs and billionaires, and they have to go through filtration systems. So there is no one that's going to be able to get to that seat of power without making a lot of deals, thousands of deals before they even get there. And this is something I always say to people, even if you trust somebody as a politician, ultimately, if somebody is that much of a threat to the system, it's unlikely they're going to make it there. So the system that I guess we could hope for in the future is probably not going to be this golden age of liberty again. It's probably going to be something where at least we have a sound system of money. You can save in it. It's not going to destroy you financially, but I don't see any other system that will work unless it's got gold in that system. Is that fair to say, Shan, that the foundation of any brighter future is going to be the monetary system first, and then hopefully get rid of some of these corrupt elements and they'll get filtered out? Because you can't do a lot of the things they want to do, like perpetual war and scamdemics and all the other things, if you don't have the ability to print money. If you take away that ability, it makes it very difficult to expand that corruption to the levels we've got today, doesn't it?
I get what you're saying, Mike. The point you're making is that powers to be, will not given so easily. If I were to sum up your arguments in a single line. And for precisely this reason, I don't think it's going to be the US that is going to return to the gold standard first. It is going to be some other country, probably the BRICS currency. And that will force the US to adopt our gold standard as a response to it. Just assume we have a BRICS gold currency in place. And if the US continues to indulge in this deficit spending, then they'll have to pay for all of their imports with gold. How long do you think all of the imports of the US can be sustained with the 8,000 tons of gold they have? 6 months. That's all it will pay for. So once the world moves on to a gold standard, the US will not be able to survive on a fiat currency system, because of their very large budget deficits, extremely large trade deficits. The only solution that they'll be left with at that particular point in time is to move to a gold standard themselves. So the US will not voluntarily make this transition, but they'll be forced to do it despite the powers not wanting to make this change.
And how fast do you think this is going to unravel from here, Shan, in the US? Because we've got Trump and it looks like he's making a lot of moves in terms of trying to at least show that he's going to balance the budget. You've got DOGE, the Department of Efficiency. You've got lots of people in central government being told that they're going to be fired and laid off because they're no longer necessary. Then you've got this idea of onshoring lots of industry, but actually that's going to require them to really weaken the dollar, which is what got us into the mess to begin with, is the fact that the dollar's already declined 98% versus gold. So is this really just pie in the sky stuff? Is it a fantasy that he's going to be able to fix this? And actually, could he even be speeding it up? Because devaluing the dollar at this point seems to me to be saying goodbye to the dollar, which is what your book's about. So you tell me, Shan, you're the expert.
Right. I think Trump is a showman. He thinks he can make all the noise and actually not effect any kind of meaningful change. Now, had he been serious about balancing the budget, why should he increase in the national debt to 41 trillion? He wanted to change the limit to 41 trillion. Why should he want to make the change? And the one congressman who has consistently argued in favor of balanced budget, happens to be Thomas Massie. So Trump should be praising him, having him as an ally. But he wanted to remove him from the Republican Party. So Trump is making all the right noises, but in terms of real change on the ground, I don't think he's going to be able. I don't think he even understands the need to make all these fundamental changes on the ground. So, he just found a Doge and Musk to be a very convenient partner to have to win the elections. It's almost very similar to, he had an economic advisor the last time around. I keep forgetting his name. He was on CNBC. Kudlow. So Kudlow was extreme free market proponent and he was Trump's economic advisor the previous time around, right? But as soon as he became Trump's advisor, he started, instead of teaching Trump economics, he learned politics. So I think something similar is going to happen to Musk, although I don't think Musk will give in as easily as in the case of Kudlow. So at some point they will part ways because the agenda of Trump and the agenda of Musk are so vastly different. Trump just wants to have a convenient time and actually make all the right noise, as compared to Musk, who really wants to effect these meaningful changes so that we can balance the budgets. I think these two things are very contradictory. At some point, I guess Musk will walk away from Trump.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the people that are surrounding Trump, billionaires who have become very rich off of the fiat paradigm and probably wouldn't be billionaires had we not had the fiat paradigm. You know, Howard Lutnick, he's the guy at Cantor Fitzgerald who I think in the early 2000s, he accounted for the majority of US Treasury holdings. They were going through Cantor Fitzgerald, at least. They were the ones processing those treasuries. So all of these people actually were very successful in the old paradigm. I'm not so sure they would be able to recreate that in the new system, a gold-backed system. So that's one kind of contradiction to the idea that they would want to take us there. But I guess one thing that I'm thinking about, Shan, is just how this is going to affect the everyday American, because without the cheap imports from China and these very productive nations who had weak currencies, those Americans would never have made it to this point. Their salaries have been absolutely collapsing since the 1970s. And it was all those cheap goods that allowed them to thrive. And I don't think you can replace that in 5 years. I don't think you're going to replace that in 10 years. So they are the ones that are really going to suffer. And if we are going into that dollar end game as well, and those cheap imports are not coming in, it's maybe not the best thing to be doing right now, in my opinion. It's kind of like, if you are going into a famine and then you say, okay, well, I'm going to have an argument with my neighbor who produces food and an argument with the local butcher and an argument with the local baker. It's not the time to be throwing tariffs when you're in a position of such weakness.
Right.
Am I missing something here, Shan?
No, Mike, you're right. Unfortunately, I don't see a good way out for the US. I said the US used to be an extraordinary country. Okay, they used to produce about 90% of all the goods produced in the world. From that point, okay, they have slowly lost their way. And at this particular point in time, you can't think of a single industry where the US can claim to be completely dominant on the rest of the world. Even if you look at Tesla, okay, which is a fantastic car, okay, they are nowhere close to BYD. I mean, BYD is miles ahead of Tesla, like in terms of the nature of the products, their product cycle, and their cost, right? So there are not many industries where the US can compete as compared to countries like China, Germany, etc. So the US is going to have a very, very hard time, and I don't see a solution to it, excepting to state that the US should return to its fundamental basis, as was envisaged in the US Constitution. I mean, which is say limited government and sound money. And if they do that, hopefully the US people can actually find back their competitiveness. And they look at the natural advantages that the US has. I mean, they have huge land masses, they have extraordinary mineral resources. So hopefully they can use some of these things that could gain back their competitiveness. But that assumes that the US government will actually step back and actually balance a budget, which is a very, very hard thing for the US government to do.
If we look back historically, there normally has to be a period of real hardship where they kind of purge the system, all of the debt is somehow inflated away, the currency collapses, and people learn to take care of themselves again because they're forced to. The weakest in society often die either through deaths of despair, addiction, suicide, starvation sometimes. And you saw this across the Soviet bloc. After that all collapsed, the Soviet experiment,
Right.
life expectancy for men in Russia, I want to say it was 55. It sounds absurd to say that, but I think it was around 55 for a time. In the country I'm in, Poland, there was a hyperinflation. I was writing about it just last night, and people had nothing. Literally, the currency collapsed. Nobody had anything. Alcoholism was rife. Yeah, on the other side of that, things started to look up, and Poland's been the best performing European economy in terms of growth for about 20 years straight, I think now. So there are better times ahead, but it takes that collapse moment. And I guess the worrying thing that you're telling us is we are heading into that imminently now. And do you think we're talking in the next 2 years, 5 years, by 2030? How close do you think this actually is, Shan? Could it happen this year? Because it does look like the everything bubble is starting to burst right now. I don't know if you're watching the stock market.
Right.
I'm watching them quite closely right now, and it doesn't look good to me.
Okay, there are two parts to your question. I'll answer the second one first. How soon is the US going to collapse? If you look at the title of my book, it is RIP USD 1971 to 202X. So I'd given myself a 5-year timeline when I wrote that book that the US is actually going to collapse. And I'll still stick to that. I'm fairly certain at this particular point in time that's going to happen. Okay, maybe 27, 28. But the other thing that you said, okay, that a collapse will kind of lead to a solution. I'm not so very sure about that. If you look at the history of Argentina, about 100 years back, it was amongst the richest countries in the world. It had a per capita income that was higher than that of the US. 30 years of communist rule and another 40 years of different kinds of rule. So it actually stumbled from one crisis to another. I think over the last 60 years, I think the peso would have completely collapsed 8 times. So many debt crises. It's not till Millet came in that they found a solution. So having a crisis doesn't automatically mean that they're going to turn around and then do the right thing. I don't know what is it that is going to actually have somebody stand up and then actually deliver what is necessary for the US. It actually requires a very, very strong personality. And I don't see one, at least within the existing congressmen in the US today. I mean, nobody is able to argue against Trump. Okay, the fact that even today he's not arguing for a balanced budget. See, it is so easy to stop this increase in national debt. He should just pass an order that I'm not going to sign any bill that will lead to an increase in the national debt. Okay, then the Congress would automatically be forced to balance the budget. Okay, but he's asking for a big, beautiful budget, and he argues for an increase in the national debt to 41 trillion. Right? How is it going to solve the problem? It's going to make it substantially worse. And if you look at the US national debt, that's 36 trillion. 26 out of this 36 trillion are short-term bills. It is going to come up for renewal in the next 3 years, right? So, I mean, we are looking at a humongous amount of treasuries coming into the market over the next few years that I think the collapse is very, very near at this particular point in time.
I agree. And, I actually feel like the US is going to end up looking more like the Soviet Union, not less like. They're going to go through the collapse and actually end up like the Soviet Union. That's my personal opinion, where they just chug along. They've got a lot of power still. There'll be a lot of control over ancillary nations. I think that's kind of what they're setting up for now, actually, Shan. These renegotiations with all of the nations across Europe and Canada and Greenland, I think it's actually the US preparing its post-collapse empire. It's not to reignite itself as such. It's actually trying to make these nations dependent on it so they don't turn immediately towards China and isolate the US.
It's going to be similar to the USSR, like in some sense. But if you look at the USSR, all their citizens had been used to a low standard of living for an extremely long time. Okay, but US has been a rich, prosperous society, and suddenly they're going to collapse over the next 3-4 years. So this kind of a dramatic shift, okay, from being a rich country to an extremely poor one, has not happened in history that I can think about easily. I think the closest would be the Germans. Actually, would be the collapse of the German paper mark that happened between 1919 to 1923. Okay, but for a large country like the US, I don't know how it's going to handle. I don't know how the citizens are going to behave when they find, okay, that the salary that they earn is actually not sufficient to even buy groceries. I think it's going to be very, very hard. All the instances that are reported, like theft, it's going to become far more commonplace than what is actually seen today in the US.
Yeah, and they have in America more guns per capita than any other nation on planet Earth. So there's that as well. There's also the most medicated society in terms of psychotropics and antidepressants. So it's a toxic situation over there when it does fall apart. And I think partly that's one of the reasons why I chose to come actually live in a country that has been through a recent experience of really bad times and hardship and hyperinflation. It was only 1990 when it fell apart here. And before that was Soviet times. So my wife even remembers living in a hyperinflating currency and actually living under communist rule. She was brought up in it. So everyone here has a garden still. Even people who live in apartments will have gardens growing food out back, which blew my mind when I got here because I never knew apartments could even have gardens, but they do. They have allotments all around these apartments. And that actually goes back to Soviet times because people were so poor that if you lived in an apartment to work at a local factory, you still had to grow some of your own food to survive. And that still exists. So people who have lived through hard times recently will probably adapt much quicker and they'll go back to living a certain way. Whereas in the West, we haven't had that recent experience of hardship. And the other big difference as well is societies, let's say, east of Germany, not many people there have their wealth trapped in financialized assets. It's in land and it's in property, which again, it can go down in value, but it's not going to zero. In the West, our entire wealth, most people's entire net worth, besides the house they live in, is tied up in financialized assets that are in an everything bubble. And that means that when that thing comes apart, the net worth of people is going to be reset to zero. The pension system will collapse. Medicare, Social Security, it's already bankrupt. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Shan. Are we actually in that phase now where we see the everything bubble collapse? Because I know some people in finance who are pretty successful and they're telling me that it is the moment, that this is actually it. We're living through the first stages of it and it's going to happen over the next 6 months.
You could well be right, Mike. I try to think about this topic. I know the collapse is coming. Okay, maybe 3, 4, 5 years. But is this the moment? It could well be. Is this a year where all bubbles unravel? Probably. By the housing bubble in the US, it's all the numbers indicate, okay, that is actually much worse than what happened at the depths of the 2008 crisis. Right? If you look at the housing inventory, the people who have not been able to pay, all the numbers indicate that the bubble has already popped. Okay. But the actual statistics reported by the government are hiding the true extent of the collapse. I think the US housing bubble will actually pop this year, and that will open the floodgates. I don't think the stock market or the bond market will actually collapse first, because that can be propped up. Okay. But the US government will find it very difficult to prop up the housing bubble when it collapses. And that is going to actually open the floodgates. And how it's going to pan out, I mean, who knows? It's going to be very hard. Okay, but we can be certain about one thing, that the US government will not do what is right. Okay, we just step back and actually allow the collapse to run its course. They are going to repeat what they did in 2008 in a much bigger scale. So you're going to have QEs, they might call it something else at this particular point in time. Okay, but they are going to have deficits that are $5-10 trillion per year. And that is not going to be a good thing for the US dollar. So it's going to be a very, very hard time. It's hard to think about it, how the US society is actually going to collapse. It will probably start this year and it's going to run for the next few years.
Okay, everybody, we're going to leave it there for part number 1, but we've got plenty more to come in part number 2 for members over on parallelmike.com. And we pick right back up where we left off. I get Shan's take on silver. What does he think of it? Is it a good metal to invest in, and why? We also talk about gold and silver miners. What are the risks and what are the rewards? So it's a very practical part number 2, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. And don't forget to check out Shan's fantastic book as well. One more time, it's called RIP USD, and it's available on Amazon.com or your local Amazon, whichever country you are in. One more reminder, we do have group coaching for investors coming up in May 2025. This is the 5th group I have run thus far. There will be limited spaces for this, and it always fills up very quickly. So if you are interested, please check out parallelmike.com. You can watch a video and find out more information. In closing, please take care of yourselves. Have a fantastic rest of the week, and I'll see you all in the next one.
What you are basically. Deep down, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you the people have the power.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.